Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Anna Janewski. I'm a curator at the Museum of Modern Art, and I'm one of the co-organizers of the exhibition Judson Dance Theater, The Work Is Never Done, together with my colleagues Thomas Lax and Martha Joseph. This morning at 11, prompt, Thomas, in his remarks, he thanked everyone by name. And now we are more than a half of the Today program. So I would like once again to express our gratitude to the staff of the Judson Memorial Church, to the staff of Movement Research, and also to our colleagues from the Educational Department at MoMA. Woo! Not only they made this beautiful event possible, but the series of conversations that we had with them in the last year or more were really important for us to think at the show we did, to organize all this project, to think how we can translate and move something that happened right here 50 years ago, downtown, to midtown in the White Cube. And this is, I can tell you, a pretty difficult and almost impossible task. So all those people were fundamental for the conversation we had, exchange we had. And also I think that the exhibition and the project would be incomplete without this event today. This event is hugely important for us. And so thank you really from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you so much. And my task is to introduce Barbara Moore, and I don't think that Barbara really needs an introduction, particularly not in this community. Her work, her incredible work as an art historian, scholar, writer, editor, as a dealer of artist book, and also, and particularly, as a director of the Peter Moore's Archive. Barbara was an active participant and observer of all the events that happened, all the cultural events, of the performances that happened in downtown in the 60s. And she brought Peter Moore to Judson, here to the sanctuary. And basically, Peter started making photos, and his photos are the main reference, one of the main references and sources for Judson, for what we know about Judson. So doing an exhibition about Judson Dance Theater without working with Barbara was, again, completely impossible. And we had the privilege and the luxury of spend days, months, I think the whole process was almost a year. We would go to her office, to the archives, and Barbara also gave us a fantastic advice, which was like, don't focus only on the 16 concerts. Let's start a bit before, and let's look what happened all around, what happened around Judson at that time. So we would go photo by photo, and not only Barbara would tell us who was in the photo, what performance it is, but she would give us a context of where it happened, how it happened, anecdotes. And this was so special and so important for us also to think how we do a show. What does it mean to present this material, how you mediate this material, what's the importance of the oral history of the world, of the slideshows. So it was really, really important for us. It was like instrumental. And so we had this privilege of doing it for almost a year, but we also now would like to share this privilege of a half an hour of Barbara presenting some unknown Judson Dance Theater material. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna, for that very special introduction. And of course, I have to thank your colleagues, Martha and Thomas, as well, for, the whole team, the whole MoMA team working with you and what you've accomplished. I want to give very special thanks from my personal experience, which goes beyond this project, to everybody at Judson, in the Judson community, the ministers, Donna Scapper and Micah Busey, and working with Andre Dautry and Zach Mosley and the team here in setting things up. And Tim has come from Anthology Film Archives to help. Judson for me is a community that goes way back in many, many respects. I'm still involved with the church, or I became newly involved several years ago when I moved nearby. Their artistic, political, and social outreach is just amazing and really enriches everybody. So in the midst of all the seriousness about us, which is artistic, political, and social, I am going to talk about humor. And I'm going to start with James Waring, because Peter's and my introduction to his work occurred only a few days after our first exposure to Judson Dance Theater at Concert of Dance No. 4 in January 30th, 1963. We had no idea at this point in time of any Judson dancers' histories, interrelationships, or associations, and yet there they were, a slew of serious performers, many of whom would become known rightly or wrongly as postmodernists, doing madcap things, totally madcap things. Jimmy was not a participant in the formative Robert Dunn workshop that gave rise to Judson Dance Theater, and as a result, even though he gave several concerts at Judson, he's not technically considered part of that group. He could be campy, arch, obsessed with costumes and props, and eccentric, as well as elegant and graceful. He referred to his dances as ballets, and many of them were clearly that. He was outrageously witty and seemed to have his finger on the pulse of the times, feeding into and deriving inspiration from an incredibly diverse range of aesthetic situations: classical ballet, modern dance, happenings, pop art, and the poetic haiku-like conceptual events initiated by Fluxus artists such as George Brecht. And people from all these disciplines contributed in many ways. I could do a whole lecture on Jimmy, but just the costumes and the props and the things were all done by different people, and you'll only see a fraction of that here today. Bits and pieces of Jimmy's choreography remain in repertory or get revived periodically, but the outrageous, goofy, happenings-like pieces I love the most are not the ones you're ever going to see recreated. I once queried David Vaughn, the most knowledgeable person on Jimmy's work, about such a possibility, and he just laughed. Lights, please, and first slide. And by the way, we have a projector that doesn't have a working remote, and Tim here, we're going to do hand signals and see if it works. Here, Tim will do it individually. So perhaps you can understand the elusive complexity of his work from the following photos of At the Hallelujah Gardens in 1963. This is a photograph of a dancer anyone involved with Judson knows. That's Yvonne Rainer, and she's wearing a box that has been painted by the pop artist. At that time, he then became a happenings artist, Al Hansen. So this is about as far in different poles as you can get. Jimmy's company at this time included Valda Setterfield, Fred Herko, David Gordon, Yvonne, Eileen Pasloff, Deborah Hay, Elizabeth Keene, Barbara Dilley, and Arlene Rothlein, among others. This really a real pantheon of remarkable individualists. It was meant as the fondest compliment when Yvonne, in discussing the unconventional movements of her own early dances and how they were intended to shatter the suffocating, what she called conventions and standards of beauty and grace, paid homage to Jimmy by noting that to become a member of Merce Cunningham's company required a certain physical maneuverability, unlike Jimmy, she said, who took a lot of misfits. Or as Val de Setterfield has said, one got to be able to do all sorts of things one might earlier have thought were just not suitable, not proper, not appropriate. Next slide, I'm sorry. We have to get used to this signal system here. Okay. This is Yvonne on the left and Valda, and Yvonne is unwinding a ribbon, as I remember, from Valda in some way. I can't really tell you exactly what's happening. And in this picture, everybody's blowing those party whistles that uncurl with a feather at the end. And so they're having semi-balletic poses, but they're doing something totally wacky. And that's Jimmy in the black leotard in the center left. Jimmy's antic use of props is consistent with art's renewed fascination with the object in the early 1960s. After the overwhelming dominance of abstraction in the 50s and the particularly intense, often grandiose manifestations of abstract expressionism, the object had a resurgence, not just in pop art, but in assemblage and the small gestural performances and artworks of Fluxus. These tended towards concretism, that is, the object as itself, neither depicted nor recreated nor romanticized. Throughout the 60s, Jimmy did occasional improvised lecture demonstrations, often in collaboration with the composer and Judson performer John Herbert McDowell, in which they skewered the functions of an assortment of mundane and exotic objects. The first one you saw was at the Café Au Go-Go in 1964. This one is John Herbert and Jimmy at the Bridge Theater in 1965. And they would just have tables piled with all kinds of things that they would then... This is like way before someone like Stuart Sherman and other people who were working with objects in the 80s and 90s and since. The only piece Jimmy had on an official concert of dance program was in concert number 12, which took place in August 1963. It was in a small theater called the Gramercy Arts Theater with a small proscenium stage. It's called Imperceptible Elongation Number 1. It opened the program, and Fluxus-like was over in an instant. With precision timing, hands of invisible performers burst through a large paper screen, showering confetti, and accompanied by large white paper balls sailing over the audience from the balcony. Even before the formation of the dance theater, the church had a literary component called Judson Poets Theater, which continued to give regular performances for many years. Here's Jimmy, again, dancing with Deborah Hay, applying his inventiveness and wit to directing as well as choreographing beat poet Diane de Prima's poem script, Poets Vaudeville, at Judson in 1963. John Herbert McDowell, a close friend of Jimmy's, who also often collaborated with him, as you saw in the previous photograph, was one of the many composers whose presence attests to the cross-fertilization between disciplines that characterized Judson Dance Theater. And like many others, he came to these programs as a non-dancer who both danced and created dances. This is a photograph of Auguries, in which he's on a platform, seemingly unable to control his hands, which had a zany life of their own, wildly slithering off the side of the platform, disappearing into his sweatshirt pockets, all sorts of what Jill called funny things to do with hands. And by the way, you can see Peter shooting this from the balcony here. From the audience, you had the hands maybe more out in front of you, but you didn't always see what was going on quite as well as here. John Herbert's precisely titled Eight Pas de Deux, Pas de Trois, and Finale, 1963, was subtitled A Small Token for James Waring's Hallelujah Gardens, which gives a hint of its frivolity. Johnston called it a silly spectacle with a lot of crazy ladies, as well as a soothing hypodermic in serious times. And of course, these kinds of silly things were happening on programs that contained many serious things. So it was a wonderful balance and variety that you would get at any individual concert. Anyway, for this piece, there was a huge cast, and the music was completely made of waltzes. It was a tape collage of waltzes by over 40 composers. Each ensemble was funnier than the last, and it all came to a tremendous climax. Here's one of the 8 pas de deux. John Herbert is frolicking with Trisha Brown. Sally Baines, whose 1983 book, Democracy's Body, remains the definitive study of Judson Dance Theater, associates humorous styles with the more flamboyantly theatrical choreographers in the group. David Gordon, whom you're more likely to know today as the polymathic creator, writer, choreographer, theater director, and performer that he has become, was another Judson choreographer with eclectic sensibility and who used humor, lots of object props, and costumes. David's humor in this period was more pointed than Jimmy's. His Random Breakfast, 1963, which he called a lavish escapade that included at least a dozen costume changes, innumerable accessories, props, sound cues, and complicated timing, and by the way, all of that was accomplished in 30 minutes, satirized, among other things, the very processes of making dance that the Judson members themselves experimented with. It was in 6 sections, starting with an elaborate and hilarious strip by Valda Setterfield that David said made her look like Queen Mary taking off her clothes in public. And David used a lot of thrift shop clothing. He even talks about this a lot in describing a lot of those early works. And here in this next picture, that's David in his Spanish costume. And the next one is Valda as a nun. Robert Morris called David's work expressionism which lies beyond official dance technique. Jill Johnston referred to David and Valda as 2 Art Nouveau comedians who have been the unwitting commentators on the scene they helped create. Eddie Barton only created 1 work in 2 variants for the workshop, but it was a small gem on the cusp of performance art. Pop number 1, once again held up an object to ridiculous examination. Barton came out on stage, laid out a mat, blew up a balloon, and set it on the mat, briefly raised a finger in a gesture of checking the wind, then suddenly flipped backwards, landing stomach first on the balloon that broke with a resounding pop. This gesture was so deft and unexpected that it had the audience in stitches. At the next concert, the program listed Barton's pop number 2. He appeared on stage and made the same exact preparations, but playing with the audience's expectations that he would repeat his stunt in the same way, He faked missing the balloon, then quickly flipped a second time to make the perfect pop. Alex Hay was, and still is, a pop-oriented painter and sculptor. He actually has had shows in the last few years at Peter Freeman Gallery, although he doesn't do performance anymore that I know of. Anyway, like so many other Judson participants, he had not previously created performances. His work lacked the Olson and Johnson Hellzapoppin abandon of Jimmy's, John Herbert's, and David's pieces. And while being humorous, was also conceptually minimalist. It might be regarded as a cross between the early task pieces and conceptually fueled dance constructions of Simone Forti and the fluxus dialectics of George Maciunas, and that's very much my linkage. I don't think any of these people would like being compared that way, but it's the single-mindedness of Alex Hay's work that strikes me on so many things, as you'll see. These single idea pieces were hilarious in their simplicity and Alex's dogged determination to see them to the end. The first one took place in November 1963 when the Dance Theater presented an evening-long collaborative event in which each choreographer created a work that utilized one of several sculptures specially created for that evening by Charles Ross. The works were as diverse as the participants themselves, and actually there's a slideshow of Peter's photographs in the MoMA show showing just a lot of the events from this particular evening's performances. So Alex, in his piece titled Prairie, and he literally attached himself to this pipe structure made by Charles Ross. He tied himself to 3 pillows and kept repositioning himself along the bars, trying to keep the pillows under him. An audio tape of his own voice kept asking, "Are you comfortable?" and making comments such as that he didn't look comfortable, to which his live voice replied one way or the other, "Yes, I'm comfortable," etc. During this interchange, he kept wriggling into new positions until he ended up on the floor. The piece lasted all of about 5 minutes. Over the next 2 years, Prairie turned out to be adaptable to different ridiculous site-specific situations. Here it is on a ladder in a small Upper East Side proscenium theater in 1964. And in the vast ceiling grid of a former television studio on the Upper West Side in 1965. And you're going to see more from this former television studio that's going to give you a better idea of how high Alex was, how high up he was. It was in this same enormous space that Hay performed Leadville, wearing a silver jumpsuit and carrying a reel-to-reel tape on his back. And hold that one for a minute. This is the size of that former television studio. And when he was doing Prairie, he was way up in the ceiling there in that grid. And then he's using the room in another way, of course, for this piece. Anyway, he's wearing a silver jumpsuit and carrying a reel-to-reel tape deck on his back and slowly descending a pole. As he traversed the huge space, I remember it as a lumbering, swaying walk, perhaps in time to whatever audio was coming out of the tape deck. Spent tape spilled out of the machine, leaving a trail behind him. Another hilarious work was Alex Hay's Colorado Plateau, shown here as performed in a Judson offshoot series called Surplus in 1964. Numbered wood paddles were attached to each of the inanimate mannequin-like dancers. The soundtrack instructed Alex to carry number so-and-so from one specific location to the stage and to another part of the stage and so on. Topsoil in spring of '66 was part of the Now Festival in a roller skating rink in Washington, D.C. Hay wore a weird but somehow appropriate costume. Could have been a maintenance worker, a beekeeper. It was a jumpsuit rimmed with metal rings. The vast floor of the skating rink was covered with panels of paper. One by one, Hay hooked a cord at the end of each panel to his costume so that as he walked, he pulled up the paper behind him. So here you see him, after he's gotten most of the paper up. I've previously noted that Alex Hay's Prairie, clocked in at about 5 minutes. Eddie Barton's Pop took even less time. Jimmy Waring's imperceptible elongation was over in a matter of seconds. And David Gordon's Random Breakfast incorporated frenetic vaudevillian sequencing and timing. Such brevity and surprise are hallmarks of all kinds of humor, from the stage to TV. For Topsoil, the floor was very large, and I remember this piece as being very long and the audience as being very restive. It was not in any way hilarious, but it shows the lengths to which Alex Hay would take a single idea. I myself had gotten used to performances in the '60s that capitalized on the state Namjoon Paik and others referred to as beyond boredom. I loved the monotony and repetition that were so focused on bringing a single monumental task to completion. Hay's exaggerated sense of time took an idea that may have originated as humor and extended it into the realm of seriously conceptual postmodernism. So Eileen Pasloff was one of Judson's most charismatic performers. Here she is in her Boa Constrictor, 1963, which she said was a dance about the fact that I love eating. Encased in feather boas, and of course, the piece is called Boa Constrictor, so this is a double entendre there. She stood in one spot miming gluttony with gestures she described as simultaneously ugly, comic, and melodramatic. From the beginning, Judson dancers had some notoriety and were invited to perform in different locations. They went to Washington, D.C., Woodstock, Ann Arbor, Michigan. I can't remember any others off the top of my head. These were usually in an art context. Well, there were other offshoots where they went to other locations, not necessarily just called Judson Dance Theater. One of the strangest environments they encountered was Kutcher's Country Club, a Catskill Borscht Belt resort where some members of the group performed in August 1965. Performances took place both indoors on a stage that I remember as the nightclub and in one section of the large verdant golf course. Deborah Hay's work, titled Hill, involved a golf cart driven by Steve Paxton, and Hay herself surreptitiously, I hope you can see it over on the left there, Hay herself surreptitiously inching along under a blanket of faked grass, blending in so well at first that it took a while to realize she was there. The Café Au Go-Go, a club on Bleecker Street, remembered today mostly as a venue for Lenny Bruce and the place where he got busted, was generally dark on Monday nights. In late 1964, those Mondays became the site of mostly Fluxus-related performances, one of which was an evening-length happenings like opera written and directed by Dick Higgins. Its all-star cast, which was way beyond the Fluxus group itself, involved Yvonne Rainer wearing a lead bra made by Robert Morris. Steve Paxton created some of the most perplexing works of any of the dancers, but he was also one of the most inventive artists, particularly in his use of props and experiments with unusual physical materials, such as transparent plastic sheeting that he made into inflatable shapes, some of them large enough for people to walk inside of. Deborah Hay said that she was mostly always stupefied and captivated by his work, even as it was boring, tedious, and enigmatic, and with a complete absence of clues of how to even think about it. Yvonne Rainer calls him her favorite wily choreographer and a grand old man of postmodern dance who was always a step ahead of most of us. He had a curious, these are Yvonne's words, that he had a curious conceptual intelligence and remarkable kinetic gifts. This is an early work called Rialto, in which he maneuvered from inside a stack of cardboard boxes. Steve was also a great innovator in other ways, of course, the most well-known being his role in creating contact improvisation. In viewing the early works of Trisha Brown, one might have been forgiven for pegging her as a slapstick performer choreographer. She often included a perfectly executed loose-limbed pratfall or other tumble, as can be seen in Peter's two well-known photographs of Light Fall, here with Steve Paxton in January 1963, and in an improvisation with Yvonne a few months later. Those photographs were, the dances were done on the roof of George Siegel's chicken coop out in New Jersey. And it was part of the AM Festival in May of 1963. In retrospect, I see this fearlessness with her body as a precursor to her later risk-taking physicality and her obsession in what she called her equipment dances with the forces of gravity. And the easy grace with which she collapsed foreshadows the fluidity of her mature movement vocabulary. I've already mentioned the Judson Poets Theater. Its production, What Happened, was unashamedly a musical with catchy melodies by Associate Minister Al Carmines, delightful lyrics from a vintage text by Gertrude Stein, and the whole under the direction of Larry Kornfeld. What Happened also marked the beginning of a long succession of collaboration between these three, the most famous of which was In Circles a few years later, which I believe moved to Off-Broadway after its run at Judson. Its stellar performers, this is in What Happened, recruited in large part from the dance theater, not only sang, but sang as they danced, starting off around the piano, still singing, and with Al still playing as they moved the piano across the space. And each performer had a star turn that, unlike Jimmy Waring's ebullient Hallelujah Gardens, or that, like Jimmy Waring's ebullient Hallelujah Gardens, showed comic aspects not usually apparent in their dance theater performances. Yvonne Rainer, Arlene Rothlein, and in the background, Lucinda Childs, Joan Baker, vamping Al and practically in the piano, Eileen Pasloff, And here's the whole cast, and you can see the very wacky poses. The piece was so infectious and the audience reacted so happily that what happened was revived several times over the next few years. I'm going to end by fast-forwarding to the early 1970s, when Yvonne Rainer, Steve Paxton, Tricia Brown, David Gordon, Barbara Dilley, Nancy Lewis, and Douglas Dunn came together as the collective they called the Grand Union, in which they invariably improvised with large dollops of outrageous humor. Thank you.